Welcome to I Could Never, a podcast about non-monogamy and the many ways it can look. I'm Genevieve from Chill Polyamory on Instagram, TikTok, and YouTube, and I'm joined as always by my co-host and partner, Ishik.
You are joined by me. I'm here. I'm feeling really good.
So today we're going to be chatting with two metamours. If that is a new term for you, a metamour is basically just the partner of your partner. It's a kind of relationship that can look a lot of different ways. So I want to show a lot of different examples. I reached out to my following on Instagram and got some great responses from people. So today I am happy to welcome our first pair of metamours, Robert and Jacob. Hi.
Hi, Genevieve. Hi, Ishik.
Hey.
Welcome.
Yeah. So, as we understand it, Jacob, you're a writer, and Robert, you are a social scientist, and both of you are focused on exploring topics of gender and justice and politics based in Canada.
Yeah, definitely.
Well, I'm excited to learn all about it, but first, we got to do some vibe or vent.
You come to me here on the day of my daughter's wedding.
What accent is that?
It's very.
It's trying to do a Marlon Brando.
Authentic, a Sicilian. And you come to me about vibe or vent.
Uh-huh.
Yeah, it's vibe or vent time.
It's vibe or vent time.
For any new listeners who aren't familiar, we have an icebreaker where we each go around and either talk about something that we are happy about, that's bringing us a lot of joy, or something that is pissing us off, that fucking sucks because the world is hard and we need to vent about it. So, Genevieve, will you start us off?
Sure. Well, I am vibing today. I'm close with this woman she's just rad. She's a community organizer, and we were talking about how to put on events and host spaces that everybody feels welcome. And I just love that I have friends that I can talk to about that, and that we both are invested in bringing people together. And I also was thinking back on when I met her, and it was almost 15 years ago on Tumblr. So I'm dating myself a little bit, but it was just like a really organically grown friendship that is still maintained and closer than ever today. So yeah, I'm vibing about that. I love that. I didn't expect it, but I'm glad it's in my life. So Robert, I would love to know what's on your mind. Are you vibing or are you venting today?
I am very much vibing. I've just moved out of the house that Jacob and I were cohabiting in, and I've been thinking a lot about this conversation and just feeling like it's. I'm sure we'll get into the details about our cohabitation and friendship and stuff, but it seems like in some ways this wonderful celebration of the last 2 years together. So I'm kind of vibing with all of that.
I love that.
That's awesome. Well, I'd love to throw it over to Jacob. Jacob, are you vibing or are you venting today?
I'm going to vibe, even though there is so much to vent about in the world right now. I have had the really cool opportunity over the last couple of weeks while I've been out visiting the west coast of Canada to spend a lot of time with very close friends' kids. That kind of time building those relationships with little ones has been incredibly meaningful for me. It's kind of surprised me the extent to which it's been meaningful and impactful. I've really loved every second of that, even the hard moments. Kids are really cool in that you're like really in it. It's super present and moods change so fast, but you can go from a really tough moment to a really beautiful one in the blink of an eye. I've loved witnessing that and being a part of that in this friend's life.
That's really beautiful.
I also super relate with my niece and nephew, and like, yeah, even those hard moments are really impactful. So I definitely feel you on that. And you know what? I'm going to go ahead and close this out as a rare all vibes episode. We're all vibing. Because I'm also vibing. And it's a little, this is another one of my like slightly odder vibes because it's like based out of a kind of not so fun place, but like I've talked before on the show about being a gamer, and I have been playing hardcore World of Warcraft for a couple of months now. And essentially the idea being that if you die, you die. It's done, right? Your character is done. That's it. And last night, my character died from a stupid mistake on my part. That sucks. But having encountered so many other people who've had that happen to them where their characters die, and it's like this pretty like crushing moment because there's this feeling of like loss from like, oh my God, hundreds of hours or thousands for some people have just dumped down the fucking drain. I felt surprisingly like okay about it. There's definitely a version of me in the past where I would have been really self-flagellating. Can't believe I did that. You're so stupid, Ishik. And so like seeing that growth in myself is really a positive feeling. And also, I was just like super filled with a lot of gratitude in the moment of my life and how full it feels, all of my friendships and relationships. It came to my mind very quickly.
Yeah,
Anyways.
he came out of the room so happy and glowing, and I was like, "Whoa, what happened?" He's like, "My character's gone." And I was like, "You say more. I don't understand."
And even you were like,
Yeah.
"Oh no!" Like,
Yeah.
"Oh no!" And I was like, "Yeah, it sucks."
Yeah. Yeah.
We can get to the good stuff, which is getting to know our wonderful guests. So, if each of you could tell us a bit about how your relationships look, how your relationship structures look, what non-monogamy means to you personally, why don't we go ahead and start with Jacob?
Yeah, happy to. I think I'll start off by saying it looks very different than it did at the beginning of my non monogamous journey. At this point, I think the closest thing that is maybe commonly recognized as a label to what I'm doing is relationship anarchy. I can't say I love it as a label, to be honest, but something I really love about this approach to non monogamy is it actually de-hierarchizes. I don't think that's a word, but
It is now.
That's the new word. Yeah.
okay, it is now. It does it flattens the hierarchy. What that looks like is I get to make my own choices about who I'm in relationship with. So does everyone else. Friendships have really been the relationships that have proven some of the most lasting and strongest and most supportive. I would say that I am in love with many of my friends. I don't just love them, I'm in love with them, and I feel that back. And that doesn't necessarily mean that there's any sort of romance or sex. It just means that I think the depth of feeling that I have is really able to be the same for those people as it is for a lover, for a romantic partner. And so that's my feeling.
Yeah, I love the fluidity of that, and being in love with your friends is something I relate to as well. Yeah. So I'd love to hear, Robert, as well, what your non-monogamy looks like at the moment, and then how it also relates to Jacob.
In my case, non-monogamy is a relatively newer thing, and it's really only over the past 2 years and change that non-monogamy has really come to be a significant part of my life. Prior to that, a lot of my experience with non-normative relationship structures came by way of kink, which I have a lot longer kind of experience with, and I would describe my non-monogamy right now as being, non-hierarchical. I have a partner that I share with Jacob, or however that might be phrased, but we'll be referring to her as T. I'd say that without necessarily delving so much into the theory to the extent that I might otherwise, I've kind of found this sort of organic formation, practicing what I think most people would identify or characterize as relationship anarchy, to be really liberating.
And I would say, kind of to bring it over to Jacob, you kind of hinted at things maybe not going so smoothly at the start when you were first exploring non-monogamy. So I would love to hear more about that in general, but also kind of what was sort of the draw of non-monogamy for you initially.
So I'm a bit of a slut, and I'm very comfortable with that. And I think like 10 years ago, I'd ended a multi year relationship with someone I was living with at quite a young age. I was figuring out a lot about myself. I was exploring my sexuality and in the process of coming out as queer. And I was enjoying a lot of new relationships. So one was I was going to say fell in love with, fell in lust with. I really liked a exchange student who was visiting from Sweden, and I kind of shared that with her, and she said, "Well, I don't actually believe in sexual monogamy, so if you're okay with that, then we can like explore something here." And I remember my mind being kind of blown by that. The other thing that happened around that same time, which coincides well, I had a friend who was like, "Hey, I think you should read The Ethical Slut." And I was like, "There's a book called The Ethical Slut?" So I read that book and I was like, my life could be so different. But it wasn't actually until I met T 2 years after that, maybe a little bit less. And T had recently ended a 5 year monogamous relationship 5 days before we went on our first date.
Oh, wow.
And on our first date, I was like, this is it. I am like, I'd been dating a lot, and I was like, there's something really, really special here. I really want to connect with this person. And she was like, by the way, I'm not interested in starting any new relationships right now, and I just ended this one. And I was like, well, I read this book this one time, and she'd happened to be also in the process of exploring her own sexuality, and that was like of interest to her. And she was aware of non-monogamy to some extent before that. So the entire relationship that we built was on a foundation of non-monogamy 9 and a bit years ago.
I imagine, I mean, so much can happen in a decade. I would be really interested to learn a little bit more about what your relationship was like back then and how maybe it's changed or looks different today.
For a few of those years, the first few actually, we cohabitated. We first identified as like primary partners in a hierarchical structure. We evolved to a place that I think actually we said we were non hierarchical, but we were really actually still practicing hierarchical polyamory. And T and I had been in a relationship with someone else together that had been really intense and great for the time that it lasted. And when it ended, we were both quite heartbroken. And I think for me, and for both of us, what that relationship had been doing for the time that it lasted was filling a lot of the gaps where we weren't meeting each other's needs. Um, and when it ended, we really were able to see that, well, maybe we weren't at the time. It just was gone, and we had all these gaps exposed where had expectations or obligations of each other that we weren't able or even wanting to live up to when we stopped living together, but decided and like committed to still being in familyship is what I like to call it, and in partnership. We really let each other be the people that we are. We love each other like deeply and dearly, and we know we'll be in each other's lives for the rest of our lives.
I love hearing about that arc because I do think it is a common one, at least in terms of the concept of hierarchy. When you realized, oh, wait, we're saying we're not doing it, but we're kind of doing it. Do you have any examples of like what you realized you were doing and then what you did to try and let go of it?
Mhm. Good question. I remember a really hard conversation where I shared with T, like, I want to fall in love again. I want to feel a certain type of care and affection that I don't necessarily feel like I'm getting in the quantity or volume that I want, and that being a really tough moment. And I met someone, and I think did fall in love quite quickly. That was at a different pace than T was moving through, and that really created rupture and tension in our relationship. Me trying to balance like truly being in love with two people as opposed to having some relationships that were, close friendships and play partnerships, but not with the same level of intensity. Um, Managing a certain level of emotional depth and intensity, and not, in my opinion, not doing a great job at that at the time. I think that really forced T and I to do a lot of unpacking of how we had been showing up for each other previously, and that other relationship, which I'm no longer in, but lasted for 5 years, was really a catalyst for the perspective shift that led us to be where we are now.
Rob, when did you and T first get together then?
She messaged me. I think she just opened up a FET account.
For the listeners, that's a FetLife account.
Yeah. So I'd been kind of exploring, especially Shibari, and it was something that was really meaningful to me for kind of personal reasons, for kind of heritage reasons to some degree. And so I'd been tying friends in the basement with the person I was cohabitating with as we were kind of drifting apart, moving toward separation. And the partner of one of the people I was tying that he had become friends with, and he recommended me as somebody who was getting interested in shibari. And so she messaged me on FET, and we kind of connected. And it was 2 days after the breakup had finally taken place and been like officially articulated with me and this other person. We're still living together, and so I meet with T for drinks and oysters, and she was asking me a little bit about my dynamics, and I'm like, yeah, I'm not gonna lie, I just had a breakup 2 days ago, and she was like, oh, do you want to like talk about that or anything? And I was just like, keep it together, keep it together, keep it together, keep it together. Yeah, no, I'm good. I like, things are amicable. I'm doing fine. And lo and behold, there was great chemistry, mutual attraction, and it wasn't too long before we were tying together initially in a really connected, kind of caressing style. It was at that point where she was planning to move back to the West Coast within about 6 months, and we were kind of like faced with this question, like, okay, this is growing, but we know that we're not going to live with one another. I, at the time, was still actually living with who was now kind of my ex. So, what are we going to do? Are we going to like keep this casual surface level, or why don't we just go all in and enjoy the time that we have? Making every single meeting, every single kind of moment count while we still had it, and kind of leaving the what to do later up to what developed from that. That's what we decided to do, is just sort of explore as deeply as we wanted to and as felt right, and that continued to deepen and deepen, knowing that we had no intentions to be living anywhere near one another. Like, it's about a 5-hour flight apart, and that was one of the best decisions of my life.
I love that willingness to really jump in, for something that you are feeling is right, and not kind of prescribing to this idea that not living together or not living even in the same time zone, um, that doesn't have to be a deal breaker.
Yeah. I'm also really curious, like, at what point did you and Jacob wind up meeting? Like, how did that happen?
I met Jacob when I was invited to my second ever Passover dinner, which Jacob was hosting. It was this wonderful, radical, progressive version of Passover. And I was kind of curious how that would go. I'd not really met a partner of someone I was seeing, with this level of depth before. And it was such an important thing for him organizing this Passover. He was in like a blazer and was had this like positive, nervous energy, and was like super accommodating and friendly, which I didn't not expect, but it was just like kind of the warmth that he brings to like every relationship, that I was like, oh, this is what it means to just show up in true support of your partner, and in openness to a poly dynamic. All of that ended up precipitating how he and I ended up living together, I guess.
I like that, by the way. Radical Passover sounds fun as hell. Um, Bring us from Radical Passover to the two of you living together.
I love when Rob shares real anecdotes because sometimes I don't remember them and it reminds me, and I get these like warm fuzzy feelings because it brings up the memories that I just didn't even have there. But I think it was pretty soon after that. This was like spring, a few years ago, and my partner at the time, H, and I had been living together in an Airstream trailer for the last like year and a half, and we had, as far as sharing a 22-foot long space, really maxed out that living arrangement and needed a change. And It was pretty soon after that T and I were in the process of attempting to sell our house as she prepared to move back to the West Coast. And so we had sold our house, and then the house sale fell through, and we were like, uh-oh, what do we do now? For some reason, the solution that came to mind was, it was like, well, what if my partner H and I moved into the house that I'd, a few years ago moved out of, and then we also got a roommate to help offset the costs of that. Rob and I had only met a few times still at the time, and I was like, hey, do you think Rob would want to move in with me and H and be our roommate?
Yeah, that was an interesting moment, right? Because I was now living in like the guest room of my ex partner, you know, feeling pretty down on everything aside from this one new relationship I had. And then T says to me at some point, she's like, "Hey, how would you like to like move into my house, like to my room when I'm when I move out?" And as far as I knew, Jacob, aside from a handful of these meetings, he's just like this mystery guy who lives in this cool trailer and travels around. And I'm like, yeah, fuck it, let's give that a try.
So yeah, I wanted to ask, many anarchists or people that are invested in anti-hierarchical non-monogamy are also very invested in building community and group collaboration. And I'm just curious if that is a part of your life, if you have the time or energy, or if it's much more, deepening rather than broadening your connections.
There's definitely some overlap in a lot of the worlds that lots of people I engage with, lots of my friends, lots of my lovers know each other. And I think that's one of the reasons why relationship anarchy is what I practice today, rather than what I maybe used to do more of, what I see other people doing, which I think is like more like rigid structures. But from building a collective dynamic, I love when that happens naturally or organically. I certainly in my life place no pressure on that occurring. There's a part of me that craves that, we all live in tiny homes that are our own homes in the future, and like we're a bunch of friends and people who really care about each other. But when I try and think about how to actually do that logistically, it just feels like a fuck ton of labor that I actually don't want to take on. And I'd rather, I think, just focus more on the deepening of individual relationships, the supporting of the relationships I'm in and of those people in their other relationships, and not actually focus on this community or collective perspective too much. So that's my feeling.
I think that when it comes to community, I would say that that's, in my experience, what has brought this particular dynamic together. It was by way of my connections and friendships and community with people around kink that led me to connect and be involved in this whole community around poly. One of the catalysts for a lot of this happening was our house. In a lot of ways, it became a place where we were able to host play parties and things like that, and the planning of those, and the and having the privilege of a private space for creating these spaces for community to form. But like, even in just like group chats that we have that have like queer kinky poly folks in their 40s through to their early 20s, like able to be in just light conversation, able to do everything from fundraise if somebody needs some support, to just pose questions about their own identity, how they're navigating things, and have elders and so to speak in the community, or like people with some extra experience kind of weigh in and offer that kind of support, share how and where it gets better. Like, that knowledge is like hard earned in individual ways, and when we find one another, I think the constellation of all of these knowledges ends up creating magic, and the payoff is just so extraordinary. And it makes me very hopeful for the potential futures that we could realize together.
Yeah, I I love that. I love how we take care of each other, and we're fucking good at it.
Yeah. Rob, I wanted to ask, so you touched on kink a bit when you were talking about that. To the extent that you're comfortable, would you share a bit more about your personal connection to kink?
Yeah, I think that kink, relative to non-monogamy, was kind of my first inroad to thinking about how relationships need not necessarily be exclusive, and also how pleasure, desire, connection can be expressed and intimacy can be expressed in such a wide range of ways. One of the first munches I went to, I remember being close to blown away by when somebody said that they were asexual, and that kink and BDSM for them wasn't a sexual act, and that they didn't really relate in that way, and that was kind of the opening to realizing how broadly we can express and practice our desires, how we can experience pleasure, and so on and so forth. And so then when it comes to non-monogamy, I think that it's been a great primer for being mindful of positionality, of power dynamics that can emerge, aspects that are involved in a queer liberation project, a way to explore in my private life a lot of things that have resonated with me that I would try to advocate in my public and political life.
Kind of jumping off of that, as I understand it, you, Robert, are pretty firmly identify as straight. Is that correct?
Yeah.
Yeah. So, as a straight cis guy, navigating these spaces, being in group texts and communities of various sort, events and stuff with a lot of queer people, it's very clear as you are speaking about a lot of this that you're very thoughtful and mindful about these systems and kind of your place in them. But I'd love to hear if you've ever encountered or experienced like awkwardness or tension, or if people have perceived you potentially as an unsafe person because of being a straight cis guy, right? And how have you kind of navigated those situations to find equilibrium and everyone feeling good? Yeah.
I've really taken a default attitude that these spaces are not necessarily designed for me, and that they don't have to be about me, and that's okay. In more recent years, I think I've been consistently felt really welcome in queer spaces. I think that my experience in grad school was one where I think where people are exploring these kinds of ideas and are justifiably vigilant about the centrality of straight cis white guys in these. It's important that in these spaces, that they don't have to be centered around whiteness, they don't have to be centered around cis heteronormativity. And so I view myself kind of as a guest in these spaces in some ways, and I take the kind of the welcoming into those spaces as being a thing that allows me to show up as I am and to participate in queer joy and hopefully contribute as I'm asked, in ways that I'm asked to do to participate in queer liberation.
I saw a TikTok the other day that was sort of tying queer liberation with men of any orientation becoming friends with each other, because so much stigma gets put around softness or sharing of emotion, or, fear of being associated with something quote unquote feminine, or fear of being perceived as queer. And so, yeah, I'd never heard it so succinctly linked before, but how an investment in queerness being normalized and accepted, and queer people feeling free and safe, can also help men of any orientation.
One of the things that my friendship with Rob has really helped me unpack is I have always, had trouble, I guess, like having deep friendships with other men. Most of my close friendships have historically been with female identifying or people who basically are not cis men. And as a queer man, when I was coming out as queer, I started to really try and unpack that further, but it was limited in my own progress. And this opportunity to live with Rob, to be in relationship with someone where we have this mutual person, T, in our life who really supports both of us, even just having hard conversations when we've needed to have them, and the judgment-free space that he's created, or the willingness to show up and go through that rupture repair cycle, willing to work on things with me even when I've communicated really poorly. And for me, that's really contributed to my relationship to my own gender and my thinking about gender more broadly.
Mm.
Yeah, when I think about how Jacob and I have shown up for one another, that comes up in small and large ways. My own kind of slut phase, and after T moved away, Jacob was really supportive of that in a bunch of ways, where I've come back from parties or from dates late at night, and I try to be as quiet as I can, but lo and behold, he hears me come in 4 in the morning or whatever. I wake up to a text at 9:30 on a weekend, and he's like, "Hey, I made you an omelet. It's outside your room."
Aw.
I'm like, "You made me a fucking omelet? It's the nicest thing ever." And I think that kind of ways of showing up and encouraging one another's exploration just shows through in all of these ways.
Yeah, it's interesting. Just building on that, I think that I'd say we're very different people who ended up in a very unique circumstance because of this shared relationship. And in moments where, tensions around our house or living arrangement or just like differences in personality came up, knowing that we have this person in common who we both really care about and love deeply and who is invested in each of our relationships and in some level in that sense invested in at least a sense of like mutual respect, and I think supported the way we show up. We have had the real benefit, and I'm super grateful to T about this, of having someone who like did a good amount, put a good amount of time and energy, labor into supporting us in our own friendship and relationship. And I think where I'm going with that is a lot of the time emotional labor or support in navigating, our own feelings or men's feelings in general falls on women, unfortunately, or falls on people who don't identify as men, very unfortunately. I don't think we're completely exempt from that. The last time that came up and Rob and I were sitting down and hashing something out, we were both able to reflect on when we do this, the two of us, we're actually supporting the people who support us by not asking them to do it for us, by not asking them to guide us in it, and that's meaningful to me.
I'd also add too, like I think that turning to tea kind of came a little bit later after the wear and tear of cohabitation kind of just builds up a little bit. Initially, Jacob was a wonderful support when I was still getting to know her. And I remember asking him at one point, like after she'd moved away, I'm like, yeah, like I really love this woman, like I care about her, like but I don't know how it's gonna go, like if we're always living apart from one another. And Jacob, I remember you said to me, like, you're like, look, I've known her for so many years now, and the thing you got to understand about her is like when you're in, then you're in. When you're one of her people, you're there for life. And that kind of encouragement, I think is unique because it comes from a standpoint of knowledge. It comes out of the relationship that he and her have. The fact is, like, I mean, we were having a chat before the podcast a little bit just to catch up and stuff, and T was on the call, and I was like, this is gonna probably end up as a love letter to you.
I'm curious. You mentioned that T moved away right when you moved in, Robert. So both of you lived together and both had long distance relationship with her. So a lot of times with long distance relationships, it can feel like you're binging a person when they come, it's like limited amount of time. And I'm curious, with both of you wanting to see her and spend time together, how did that get negotiated?
I'm happy again. I'll go here, and I think it's actually a pretty easy and purely logistical answer from my perspective. Um, I had the benefit of working for myself from home on my own schedule, so I had a lot of flexibility as far as where I was and when I was there. Whereas Rob is a professor, he's on an academic schedule, and his availability and when he's able to travel is quite limited, and that from my perspective made it quite easy. Like there's a lot of desire for Rob and T to have meaningful time together. Like I love seeing how happy their relationship makes both of them, and it felt easy to want to emphasize them having more time together because I knew that was limited.
I mean, I think we both like try to consider what each of us has available in terms of time and access to space and things like that. The one thing that's been absent is any kind of possessiveness. I think that is, I'd like to think, a credit to like work that we've each done for ourselves. I think it's a credit to T as being someone who's kind of sharper than both of us as it is, and would have no peace in being possessed in that way either. I've heard about and talked to people who have tried to explore these things in different relationships, and it's often like a real struggle. Issues come up around possessiveness, around hierarchy finding its way in kind of perniciously, and I just look at my experience with both of them as being like the beneficiary of a lot of that stuff that Jacob talked about earlier. A lot of the kinds of work the two of them have done with one another to kind of get to a point where I encounter just like what it looks like to be in a healthy poly relationship.
So yeah, I mean, it definitely sounds like. Well, first off, I want to say that what I'm hearing a lot of is this idea that like when people are coming in good faith with good intention and not trying to win or get or be selfish with attention or love or what have you, creates a space where that those things can get fixed. But in general, I think it's not always the case that people will love the partners of the people they love, right? Not everyone is that lucky, or just doesn't always come out that way. What kind of advice would you give to people who are in community with people that they don't always get along with?
I guess my advice is like respect is different than liking or loving someone, and I think in the way that Rob and T and I and our other partners practice non-monogamy is there's no expectation that someone's going to like or want to hang out with or want to even spend time with in any capacity necessarily are other people, but there kind of is an underlying sense, I think, amongst all of us of respect of each other's humanity and, the choices that we make as far as who we're in relationship with. That we don't get to choose our people's people, but we do get to choose how we interact with them, and respect at a bare minimum is like something that is really important to me and how we go about that. Super grateful to have so much more than respect to love Rob in the way that I do. I wrote a cheesy poem a while ago, and there was a line about like what it means to not choose your people's people, but to let them in anyway. And I think that's something that for Rob and I has actually come pretty naturally.
Yeah, I love you too, buddy. I think that the one of the other things that comes to mind is like Jacob mentioned it earlier. Like we're really really different people. We're kind of photo negatives of one another in like everything from like the way we like our coffee to just the way that we handle stressful situations, the way that we relate to confrontation and stuff like that. And by that I don't even mean like with one another, but just in general. I like a bit of friction and that kind of thing, right? And I think that in that sense of how people sometimes compare themselves to one another, or the way that when people are kind of different from us, it can be difficult to relate. I think that one of the interesting things about the dynamic we have is the recognition of the fact that the things that make Jacob so different from me bring something distinct to T's life, and that the relationship they have is so distinct and has so much value in and of itself, and that I can be satisfied in then what I bring as well. So rather than seeing it about like what I do and he doesn't, it's kind of what each of us kind of bring, and recognizing that uniqueness less as a matter of that kind of one versus another, but as a kind of complementarity. It can be fun sometimes in identifying differences as a way to see those things as complementary, rather than as dissonant. And then after that, then you can start planning road trips together and stuff, which kind of became like the big thing that really bonded both of us. It was the thing that we were really looking forward to. We kind of resolved in that first summer after living together for a year. Hey, let's do a road trip together and go visit T. We planned it for months and managed to pull it off.
What did we call it?
Called it Poly Bros Hit the Road. And we
Oh, it's so cute.
and we did indeed. We drove through the states, and we were a little curious about how it would be received, but we got in some good conversations with people, piqued some curiosity along the way.
I can only imagine.
Yeah, depends, I guess, which state.
North Dakota. No.
uh, I mean, are there any like particularly like funny interactions that happened during the road trip, or was it pretty just smooth sailing?
I don't know. I always think of this moment right at the beginning. We're still in front of the house, and we'd like told each other we were going to document this trip.
He wanted to get all this footage, basically.
And I'm like putting the camera or phone in selfie mode and making us take a video. And I'm like, okay, it's Poly Bros, hit the road. Like, I don't know, I said something like, Rob, what do you have to say? He goes, hurry up, we're late. And it was such like a accurate representation of the way we both show up, and like it Rob, you want to share something else? Yeah.
Like, so Jacob's vegan and I am most assuredly not. And so we decided to go to like different fast food joints to get what we wanted. And it ended up taking a little longer, this whole kind of thing. We get in the car, we're on the road, and then Jacob can't find his AirPods.
I'd gone while we were at separate fast food restaurants because I really like cannabis. I'd gone without telling Rob to a dispensary in Michigan and picked up some weed. We knew we were switching drivers. Rob was going to be driving the second half, and I'd gotten stoned, and I was like keeping this as my little secret. And then I get in the car, and I'm like, I can't. We're pull out. We're on the highway. 2 minutes in, I'm like, I can't find my AirPods, and I start freaking out. And Rob's giving me, a lot of generosity, and he's like, do you want me to go back? Do you want to like go through the garbage?
And meanwhile, like, Jacob's like obviously high and trying to cover this up. and I know it's like a sore spot for him, so I'm like, all right, it's cool. But like, so then finally I'm like, is there anywhere else that you want to stop? Was there anywhere else you were? And they're like, Go we stop at the dispensary? It's just like a couple more blocks this way. So we go. Yeah, he's like smoked a joint in the parking lot, I guess, or something. Still can't find the fucking thing. And I kept being like, look, we're in Michigan. We got to get all the way across the country. Like, it's no big deal if we take like an extra, 45 minutes to do this. But lo and behold, can't find it. So we get to driving, and he's like kind of kicking himself, and I'm just like, all right, we'll just have some quiet time. It's fine. And I'm drinking my soft drink from the fast food restaurant, and I'm drinking, and I'm like, what the hell's in these American soft drinks? Like, is this like fucking sugar at the bottom? It's like so heavy or something, or it's like the syrup from it. Because I'm finished it, and then I'm like, why is it so heavy? And underneath, stuck under, like wedged into the bottom of the soft drink cup, are his fucking AirPods. It's like an hour and a half later, and then I guess he'd put them in the cup holder or whatever and forgotten.
He was so calm. So generous for that entire hour. He was like, are you sure you don't want to go through garbage cans? I'll go back a second time if you want to go through the garbage. And I really, what I took from that was just the immense amount of generosity that Rob gave me in that moment of like quite a bit of shame. And I think like really feeling like I'd done something stupid and I've like lost this expensive thing.
But I think it's the situation where, like, turning back to the poly stuff, like, again, I kind of knew all this stuff because T had kind of told me. So I knew that this was a thing. He didn't, it was like kind of a sensitive spot. And yeah, I think it speaks to how like you get this useful insight from someone who's known them for 8 years. I think that has been a recurring aspect of how our friendship and our love for one another has kind of developed, that we can kind of, because of and in spite of our different personalities, have had this other lens through which to view one another. And that just happens to be through somebody who we each happen to love.
It sounds like it mirrors a lot of, what you were talking about earlier, with that, like, coming with grace and coming with open-hearted, good faith approach, right? Instead of being like, you did this to me, or you did this to me, right? Like each of you potentially pointing fingers at the other one, how could you lose your AirPods, or like whatever the conflict could be, right? It's like there's this desire to be supportive of each other, right? And yeah, have that grace. And I don't know, it's a touching relationship to hear that amount of love, let's call it what it is, right? Like that amount of love and support. Yeah, I mean, I think I would invite you, if there's any final thoughts, anything like else that you want to like leave as like a parting thought to the listeners. Jacob, we can start with you.
Yeah, Rob at the beginning of this mentioned that our first meeting was at a Passover Seder, a rad Passover Seder, and that's he was at it because I'm Jewish, my family is Jewish, and I think in this particular moment, and Rob experienced this at our Seder this year, we had a pretty different focus. We really, like, my cousin and I who organized this, my cousin's a big activist in Montreal. And it was so important to speak about Palestinian liberation. And I think about the moment that we're in right now, where there's an active genocide happening in Palestine. We've talked so much about, how we show up for each other with care and community. And I think, it's important. And I just want to say, as a Jewish person, that this genocide is real, and we have so much work to do to unpack these systems of oppression that are still, leading to grotesque violence around the world. And we keep us safe. Like, the way that we show up in relationship to each other, like, that's where real care comes in. I argue back at anyone who tries to tell me that systems of power are what actually protect us in society. For me, and I see it every day, particularly being a part of queer community, it's up to us, and queer as in Free Palestine. And I'll leave it at that.
100%. Thank you for that.
Robert,
No, I say we leave it at that. I love that.
okay, fair enough. I was gonna be like, that's
Yeah.
that's definitely a
Yeah.
moment. So, listen, thank you both so much for being here, for talking with us. We really appreciate it.
Yeah. Thank you so much for everything you shared today, everything that you gave. And if there's nothing else that either of you would like to promote or tell the listeners about, then I guess I can add here that if anyone listening wants to support families in Gaza, Google Operation Olive Branch. They are working with families on the ground to support them directly. So Operation Olive Branch is what I would suggest.
Yeah. And if you are looking for more non-monogamy content, you can find Genevieve at Chill Polyamory on TikTok, Instagram, and YouTube.
As well, I offer direct peer support on chillpolyamory.com. And if you'd like to support the show or support the work that we're doing, patreon.com/chillpolyamory.
This has been I Could Never. And remember that just because you've never done something before doesn't mean you can't do it.